Rob has a series of design discussions that he'd like to go over with the Crowbar 2 stuff. I think there's a total of 6 or 7 of them. They're already documented in the current Pebbles. Actually, sorry, in the Crowbar 2.0 sprint stuff and backlog. The cards are referenced in there. If there's a way for somebody to maybe come up with a way to easily reference them by numbers or print them up by numbers, then I'm more than welcome to respond to me in the chat. I would be happily doing so throughout.
My goal is not to read the PDF, but let me do a quick recap of where we stand with Crowbar 2. So in Crowbar 2, we effectively stopped development almost 2 months ago, I guess. And so in light of picking the threads back up, we've had a chance to reflect and review, which I think is very helpful. We've also had an opportunity to try and simplify some of how we've been coaching ship readiness, or what we call ship readiness, that I'm right now calling Crowbar 2 Core. In Crowbar 2 Core, just to arc back, is effectively the closing the loop work that we had identified. So the idea is that we can do a base deployment of physical infrastructure, including the networking configuration. So all of the implicit arc lamps in Crowbar would be considered effectively Crowbar 2, Crowbar Core in this nomenclature. And part of the realization here, when we got right to the end of the pre-break work, was that we were really trying to bite off a lot of orchestration effort inside of the Crowbar Core work. And with Andy in particular had a lot of that work, and it was creating sort of this looping effect where he would try to do some work on jig integration and then jump back to orchestration, and that was becoming very complex. So a lot of the design topics today really reflect around streamlining and simplifying some of the Crowbar 2 Core capabilities so that we can deliver a base and then begin to iterate off of that base. In the process of reviewing where we stood with the work, we built a series of Trello cards. Those Trello cards are in Trello, obviously, and then I took those cards and tried to reflect them here. They're roughly prioritized. Simon, if you'd scroll down so we can see item 1. The picture refers to all the cards, so we'll do those as necessary. This is one of the things that Victor and I had not agreed about for a while. I had chosen to do an overloaded implementation where I used the attributes to reflect the node role membership. Victor convinced me that this did not add to clarity. It was clever, and therefore that didn't. I'm recommending that we move back to a more implicit or a more explicit node role membership relationship. One of the things that we did learn was that state needs to be carried on that relationship. So that relationship is not just a simple relationship. It's actually a state-bearing relationship. So and Wayne is giving me a funny look about that.
We're masking.
The rationale for this and the way this works is that when a run finishes on a node, it typically, by the way we're designing things, is the effect of implementing a node-role relationship. So most of the actions that take place in Crowbar are the effect of a node-role action. It's really stepping back to a broader design principle that will show up. The actions that Crowbar takes are, by and large, node-role actions. And that's why this needs to be an explicit relationship. But it also means that when that action is finished, we have a discrete state for that action, for that role's action on that node. Okay? That is the atom, if you will, of, sorry, Adam, A-T-O-M, of work for Crowbar in a lot of sense. And we can talk talk about that more as we go. I'd like to go through these items, and that might help explain it. Number 2, please. This comes into part of the orchestration engine, streamlining the orchestration engine. This is something that Victor's really been a champion of, and to me this makes a lot of sense. And I think, thinking back to our long conversations we've had with SUSE about Crowbar 1, this also helps address those items. Instead of using ordering and sort of this convoluted order precedence mapping that we've had to do inside the data bags, the suggestion here is to do a strict precedence graph, meaning this, and I think it's going to come down to roles when we implement it. This role depends on this other role, which could be in another bar clamp. And so when you create that dependency graph, you very clearly can tell that this role can be executed, remember it's the atom of work, or not based on whether or not the precedent role is required. And when you build out that graph, you end up with a very clear picture of how the system deployment is going to operate. So rather than having this sort of fuzzy, I have an order, then I have an order, then I have an order, which makes it very hard to build up a dependency graph, actually makes it impossible to build up a dependency graph, we want to be explicit in the dependency and the precedence mapping. And so that would actually pull back a lot of this role information that we've stuffed all over the system to make it successful. Hold on, I'm pausing because Wayne is thinking. Since Wayne's the only person here to give me design feedback, I'm using.
And I have to apologize to Rob for not giving him feedback yesterday when I said I would.
Right.
Was engaged.
This is
No, I'm okay with this. I don't know what consequences it has. For resolving
my goal here is not to cram down this design onto everybody. These are conversations that I'm surfacing, that I've been collecting individually, and that I'm surfacing so that they can get broader visibility. These are not final decisions. These are things that we want to surface in time for us to start coding again. And so that's why I'm doing it. That's why I documented it.
The only problem I have with node role, with strict role graphing is the strictness of it, where if we look at the sad history of Linux distribution package dependency graphs, there's always the case where you need to replace or swap out a role because it's not working for you, and you don't want to necessarily cripple your entire system because one role is less than perfectly functional. So,
correct. And actually, that's an excellent point, Judd. And there's a trade-off with this. The interesting thing about making node roles the atom here, and this I actually can't get to this in a minute, is that we should be much clearer if one node role relationship is blocking a whole role from being applied. We want to see that more clearly, and so we'll go there.
Yes.
That's a many-to-many relationship for this modeling.
Say again,
Adam? So the node role thing it's the many-to-many relationship, right?
Node role is, yes, many-to-many. That's correct. And it's also, there's the interesting aspect that a role is tied to a snapshot, and I think that's the next, it's not the next point, but it's coming to that. But yes, it's definitely many-to-many.
And the states enumerations, is the number, other than the fact that numbers over 999 or whatever would indicate errors, is there any significance to the choice of number? Like, is there any ordering concept on those numbers, or is it just a simple enumeration of, the fact that we expect will probably only be, less than 10 or even 5 states, and we're just going to assign them to numbers?
Yeah, what I wanted to make sure of, so that the aggregation logic would be simple, is that there were clear ranges and not just text. What I want to spend some more time thinking through how those states will work. I know that because of the way we use text in Crowbar 1, it caused a lot of problems. And so I think there's an open question as to whether or not we could use negatives for error states or positives for positive results. I believe we need the fourth state, and it might be that null is, we could use null for the fourth state. That's probably worth some more reflection.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing what the, just a suggested list of what those states might look like, and then I think that would be a good starting point for further conversation on that.
Yeah, there are some states that were reflected in the code already, where we I started down this path. I'm actually thinking a nil would be a better for unknown, and then leave negatives to errors, which would be more conventional.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a really good discussion. I think we'll get more down in it. That'll be more as we get to implementation. Number 3 is a big one. This one's, I've broached this on the OpenStack operators list, OpenStack chef list, and we've had some discussions with it internally. And so the idea here is that we get a lot of positive feedback about the way we manage networks, although the concept of conduits has been very hard for us to translate upstream and more broadly. And so this is one of those ideas that sort of bounced around, and everybody's a little bit oogie with, using a Greg term, but at the same time, it seems like a better solution than what we've been doing before. And the idea is this: to use the construct of a role to replace conduits. And so a role, just like a conduit, a role has a certain amount of configuration that you can apply globally. For example, in a conduit, it'd be if it's a VLAN, but it also has specific per node instance, like which NIC it's done and how it's bonded. So it captures both things, and the concept of role seems to translate more easily into other nomenclatures like chef or puppet. And rather than requiring us to add a new construct, we can take advantage of a role, and then that can then span nodes. So if you had the public network role, it would be very clear in all the nodes that they were on the public network. It would probably be surfaced as network-public, obviously, but and so while that's a bit of change in the current networking code, it seems to be a big simplification in the implementation of networking for Crowbar, and so that was a recommendation that we'd come up with out of the reflection during the break, and then this has been vetted in the community to an extent.
So how would you specify dependency on one of those network roles? Would it be possible to parameterize a dependency so that it, for instance, requires like a bonded network connection or some other specific characteristic of that?
So that's a good question. So we definitely have the ability to characterize a dependency on a role between bar clamps. So that the dependency that I must have the public network is easy to capture in this current model. Whether or not it's bonded or not would be configuration. We already capture this to an extent, would be configuration of that role where you would say, I want this role to be bonded if possible, or bonded is required to be bonded. And then if bonding wasn't available in a node, that role node state would be errored if it wasn't able to configure the bond in that way. And at that point, it would become very clear where your system was breaking.
I mean, essentially, I suppose I'm asking what we'd be keying off when we specify a requirement for something like a public network. Is it like are you keying off the name of the role or some like how is that?
It would likely
matching the dependency related.
It'd likely be the convention of a name match. So network-public would be a convention. The conduits have currently the same limitation, right? You specify the conduit you want by the name. And in this case, it would actually be serviced between deployments in a way where you could pick a different role and attach to a different role. So that would allow you to have a public bonded and a public non-bonded role, and it actually exposes conduits, I think, more generically than having to have the network. The alternative is that the network bar clamp has its own special construct called a conduit, and then all of the consuming bar clamps must then be aware of the network bar clamp's concept of this conduit. And that I'm very concerned, because I've been tracking this, and Judge, you can speak up because I know you've done this even more than I have. I'm very concerned that will not be digestible upstream. So a part of the rationale for this is to make sure that our approach is upstreamable.
Yeah, it's a neat trick when you're in the config management communities. There still are not good patterns for either network or orchestration. We've got resources down and servers and nodes and external data, and a whole bunch of other stuff is down and very well understood, and even people are starting to write good cookbooks and modules that are reusable. But both of these areas we have to lead, and we have to strive to build consensus as we produce these things. Otherwise, we'll be talking. Otherwise, we will end up in a year and a half where we are now, with assets that we cannot share and don't have reusability within the community.
Have you seen an alternate pattern for dealing with networks across cookbooks, Judd?
People are abstracting them out as much as possible, doing similar things that we have done, creating library files in order to get to them. Actually, those AT&T cookbooks are a really good example. All the platform dependency, all of the networking, and what orchestration there might be is in the wrapper cookbook. But there's no one pattern. Ops code is supposed to be working on something. The Puppet guys supposedly have something, but nobody feels brave and bold enough to talk about it all that much.
So this is something that I want to keep our eyes out on. Like I said, it's a little bit oogie, but
there is the trend is not as momentum though, because after I got finished talking to the head of development of ops code, he met with a guy from Juniper who was interested in starting to fashion something with them and run the Chef client on Juniper boxes. So there's a lot of stuff happening, but nobody's coming to any conclusions. Basic primitives are still hard to establish.
So we'll keep an eye on that, but right now that's my recommendation for making Crowbar more upstreamable and friendly from that perspective.
Yeah, calling them roles. Calling them roles is roles might be getting really overloaded. I like it because it's familiar, but then you might as well also bring it down a level and call them resources and include them as a resource type. If there's network groups or types of networks as roles, we might call them a network role. You know, network role of admin, network role of storage, network role of...
I would actually make the comment that in a lot of cases our roles are resources or are services, and that's effectively what that ends up meaning. When we put something in a role, a lot of times what we're creating is a service or a resource.
Yeah, so a role is a collection of verbs and nouns, of code and config, code and data. And some of them can be of the type network. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, that's sort of where what I think of is when we put a server into a MySQL role, a MySQL server role, you're actually saying the thing in this role is providing this service. And if you put it in a MySQL client role, this thing is providing this, it's accessing this service. It's a user of that service. So I don't think it's perfect.
Yeah, we might have to bump up a level. We might have to bump up a level of abstraction there because exactly what people are running into is roles and lacking a good orchestration framework above roles to rationalize them in relation. As you apply roles to nodes, and you have many roles and many nodes within a particular role, the relationship between the nodes becomes difficult to manage. So we bump it up a layer to sort of the next highest thing.
So, all right, I'm gonna move on from here. I think we've surfaced the relevant issues to continue having discussion on it. My original objective for this was to take these topics and inject them into the list as individual items, so what I would suggest is if we want to continue the dialogue, please we can bring the whole item forward. It's partly why I put the cards in there. So item number 4, please. If you guys,
Is it not 3 that we should? Okay. Never mind. I thought it was 2.
I sort of discussed this one. Did I miss? No, maybe I missed number 2.
No, 3. 3 things like that.
Go back
We
up.
just finished talking. 3 is the one we missed. I think.
3 is network role to relationships. That's what we just covered.
Was it 2 that we missed? Result prioritization of pipeline injection based on nodes.
Yeah, I talked about that one too. All right, let's keep going. And we're on 4.
1 we did, right?
Mm-hmm. We'll get to it. We're all there.
4 is what you still need to talk about?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what I was missing from it.
You want to go to the bottom part of it?
No, this is
Okay.
so. We had a lot of ambitions on Crowbar around orchestration, and so my thought here is that we should scale them back in order to achieve the core. And the core, since the core really needs to do what Crowbar 1 does, Crowbar 1 does it pretty effectively. When I looked at Crowbar 1 and compared it, we already had captured the concept of the deployment having the proposed applying an active state. What we've missed is the queued state. Actually, we omitted the queued state because we were expecting to implement this jobs infrastructure and create some complex orchestration logic. instead of implementing any type of complex job infrastructure and scheduling, I believe that we can be successful, actually more successful with Crowbar Core, if we re-implement the very simple straight state transition model of Crowbar 1, which operates this way. You have a proposal, you make changes to that proposal. When you want that proposal to be acted on by the system, you queue it. Queuing it turns it over to Crowbar for execution. Inside of the queue, Crowbar's job is to execute all the prerequisites of the proposal. That's our late binding step. When all of the prerequisite proposals are identified as ready, then that one proposal, snapshot, or that one deployment, trying to get the language right, that one deployment can then be moved into the applying state, at which point Crowbar is going to inject the attributes for that deployment into the roles that are affected and tell the JIG infrastructure, chef in this case, to execute those roles, to execute those attributes, to run chef client on the impacted nodes. That's applying. Once all of those chef runs for each node complete to a ready state, that role, that deployment gets moved into the active state. So effectively we have, just like in Crowbar 1, where that state actually becomes the role applied state, while you're queued, you're waiting for prerequisites to be resolved. It's a very clear, definable thing. When you're in applying, you are waiting for all of the chef client runs that are for the nodes that you're impacting in that deployment to return a positive, a ready state, and then once you've achieved that, you get moved into active. So the idea here is it's very similar to what we accomplished with Crowbar 1. It's a very straightforward orchestration system. It should be very transparent, very clear. It works within the current chef run model that we have. Right, and we eliminate all concepts of jobs. We don't really need the events. We don't necessarily need the chef runs, the run concepts. A lot of those things are gone. Okay, this is actually a pretty long description in here, where I've tried to go through some detail on how this would work and what all the pieces.
You'd like to say?
Please go down. Yes.
Down, right?
Yes, please. Before I move on, are there questions or comments about that?
So what about a cancelled state or a failed state?
So a canceled state would, there are conceptual components for this, and they revolve around moving things around. If it's queued, canceling would involve simply deleting that state or moving it back, depending on if there's a proposed state or not, moving it back to proposed. The only time it can really be in a failed state would be if it was in applying. And if it's in applying, then it would, just like it does today, it would show up that node role execution, tell you exactly which node you were on, didn't, ran to an error condition instead of a ready condition. And so we can incorporate the option for retries into this, but it would effectively be stuck in an applying state. My thought would be that it would either stay there or move back into a proposed model. Actually, it wouldn't do a proposed. What would happen is you would clone it, and then you would recommit. The thing that gets interesting is that all of the subsequent deployments, if you make any changes, automatically have to be queued. So one of the subtle points in this is that anytime you move a deployment back through this process, all of its subsequent deployments, all of the dependent deployments on it, also must be moved back into the queued state. Arkady and I worked out that logic. I haven't documented.
So in that case, what if you get part of the way through applying a certain role or set of roles, and then it gets cancelled after some work has been done, or it fails after some work has been done, and then so you mark everything as proposed again, but then you've already changed something on some of your nodes. So how do you so you made some changes which are sort of inconsistent with everything else that didn't happen.
Correct. So I
so
think
what remediation?
What remediation would you have? Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
So this exact question is what led to the realization that if you put any deployment through this process, all the downstream deployments must also go through this process.
That were previously successful.
That were previously successful. And exactly right. So the trick is there's an interesting dichotomy between proposed only, which is really not a state. Proposed is I'm just waiting in limbo. Once you've actually moved to active, if any predecessor deployment moves back into queued, then all of the dependent proposals must also be moved to queued, because any change that might be partial or successful or not then must be absorbed in the queue. The trick is if you have a failed one, it's not, you have to make the decision to cancel or retry, which I would expect to be an operator choice.
But a failed application doesn't necessarily mean the system has become inoperable. Right?
Correct. As a matter of fact, it shouldn't mean that.
Well, we don't know, because you don't see that machinery of deployment. So my point is the downstream deployments, by making them queued, do you disable them?
They are, no.
So whatever application is running, it's still continue.
Still running. But by moving them into queued, you're indicating that there is a pending change to them, a pending impact to them. And so the user at that point, if it fails, that will not automatically, because you only advance to the next deployment if you've reached a ready state. So that in a failed deployment situation, the user can reject the change and take the system as is, which is intermediate state, and just say, just yank it and then let everything else settle. Or you could repropose it, reapply it, and then it would put it back through and attempt to get back to ready. So you effectively would be in a state where you would the user would have the choice to reapply or basically abandon the change midstream. Now that could mean you have an intermediate change state that you propagate downstream, but that point would be the user's choice.
I think wouldn't that be better captured in the role dependencies? In other words, I might have a deployment that depended for my application on some other deployment.
Right.
But once deployed, I'm no longer dependent on it. And therefore, an upstream change should not impact it.
There might be additional data that we should capture in the model. At this point, I would wait and see if we needed the extra data. Because right, for example, if you made a change to your SQL server and I had a Nova client, which is right, a Nova compute node, which is way downstream from that, it still would potentially be impacted, and you'd still need to walk all the way through that chain. Most of the cases where I saw where you have to walk the whole chain require you to walk the whole chain, or they're idempotent, and it doesn't matter if you walk the chain again. So most of these chain walks I expect to be no ops. But to me, it's important to be very clear that if you poke something at the top of the chain, you're going to get a wave down the chain.
Well, I think there's something that I've never been very clear on, but I think is important in that kind of logic, is being able to determine whether an application failure disables the original deployment or not in some fashion.
And that to me is still an open question.
In other words, is there some machinery for validating that a deployment is still operational versus not?
I very strongly.
Yeah. That gets into the primitives of orchestration. Do you have quorum? Do you have consensus?
I'm just saying you can't put logic on states you know nothing about.
And so I agree with you. And you know my preference on including automated tests as part of the staging orchestration. However, that is very clearly out of scope. My goal with this is
I'm just pointing out you shouldn't build a logic machinery whose states are unknowable, unless we can very clearly distinguish that doing this will be the right thing to do in any case.
What my expectation is, if you have said you're ready, you're in a stable state, and you are good until we ask you to revalidate that. So basically, a pass through this system with attributes is a request to revalidate your stable state.
So we're assuming that all applications, whether they fail or not, do not invalidate their deployments.
Great question. No, that is. I don't know that I have to put that logic in at this point. It's a great question. And so the idea. So let me rephrase this question to make sure I understand that we're talking about the same thing. If I made a configuration change to the SQL Server that broke the SQL Server, it's going to and cause that to go into an error state. By all rights, everything that depends on that SQL Server is now busted. And so that is not my assumption. My assumption in this is that the deployment of the SQL Server might have failed, but monitoring the SQL Server is a different function. Whether the SQL Server is working or not is a different function than whether or not the deployment of the SQL Server succeeded or
And
not.
I'm just talking about this in relationship to the status of downstream deployments. In other words, just because the SQL server breaks doesn't mean the downstream deployments, doesn't necessarily mean they are invalidated or requeued.
This is something to keep watching and keep discussing. Yeah. I don't think it's definitely not cut and dry.
I don't
know. So great question on that. So my thought is that we implement this very simple, what I think is much more straightforward approach to orchestrating the system. It's in line with what Crowbar 1 does, so it's much more approachable for our user base. And so that's where I got with this. Okay, role node status we talked about. Once again, this comes back to this whole atomic concept. I should add some commentary here around the role node role being the atomic unit of work, as it were, in Crowbar. And one of the things that this implies, and we've taught, it's in here somewhere else, is that node roles are not parallelized. So the idea is that we can parallelize node role actions across multiple nodes that serialize node role actions against a single node. I'm going to move on to item 6. So item 6 is it's basically a summary. It's related to the other items. I've already discussed a lot of what this is, but the idea, the added concept here is the logic of aggregate state. So if node role carries state, then when you look at a deployment, when you look at a role, the role state is actually the summation of the node roles that are under it. And then deployment states we already talked about are really the state of the roles underneath the different pointers. So remember, a snapshot can have multiple roles, role can have multiple nodes. Those are the state of a snapshot, the state of a role are actually computed based on the underlying discrete node role state. Does that make sense? It sounds a little complex to explain. It's actually much clearer in my mind than what we do currently, which is their nodes only have one state, and you have to infer which thing broke based on what went on. And part of the idea here is that when we show a deployment state, we will actually say, here's the deployment state, and here are all, if it's not ready, here's the exact node role that is violating the state being ready. And you'd be able to get that data. So that would show you progress, it would show you errors in a very, very concrete way, which is one of the number one pieces of feedback we get from our.
Showing precise error.
Showing precise error and stat
state.
Right? So the idea would be that I can look at the whole system and say, these 5 nodes are applying this role. That's exactly what's going on in the system. And those things are blocking these subsequent actions. It should be very straightforward to figure that out, right? That's my number one design goal for Crowbar 2 Core is transparency of orchestration, right? And simplicity along those lines. But, and this comes out of research that Judd had done, which was that there are multiple orchestration patterns emerging, no clear winner, and we actually are well served right now to not try to add yet another orchestration pattern, but create a simple, straightforward orchestration pattern that accomplishes our objectives, and then be able to work with different orchestration patterns as they emerge. Number 7. JIGMAP. The JIGMAP role is...
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, Judd.
Yeah, just on number 6. So this may be a stupid question, highlighting my lack of understanding about what you just said. But at the beginning of that, it says roles carry deployment states. But my reading of the stuff lower down is that the node roles would carry the deployment states, because you can have like a role can be applied in different ways to different nodes,
right?
And so
the successor failure, the successor failure of the deployment of a role onto nodes would indicate whether the role in total has been properly deployed. How do we detect that for different scenarios? You know, MySQL could be successfully deployed as a single master, or it could be successfully deployed as a master with blocks of slaves. What are the primitives that go into a role being successfully deployed across nodes versus a role being deployed on a single node? That's got to be worked out in simple primitives.
So this is a language question. You're right. The title of this item does not fully reflect the description underneath, because originally the concept would be that roles carry deployment states, period. And that in review and design actually was expanded. Roles do carry the deployment states, but as an aggregate of the node role states. So this title needs to be should be updated to reflect a little bit more nuanced definition of state.
I guess what I'm questioning is whether it actually makes sense to aggregate node role states into a role state, because as I understood it, you could have, like a MySQL server role. You could choose to apply that in a like a production context and a staging context and a testing context, and it might all deploy nicely into testing and staging, but then something goes wrong in production, or well, actually, probably better example would be the other way around. That like if it only fails in testing, then your aggregate, like, does it actually make sense to get an aggregate state that kind of across different contexts that you don't necessarily want to consider in a single unit?
So I think what you're describing would be the role type. The role itself is distinct per deployment. So in that case, the role status would be distinct for each one of those 3 deployments. So that's 3 deployments with 3 different SQL Server role client or SQL Server roles, and each one would be a status of the individual nodes on it. So while there might be a single SQL Server role type, each deployment has its own SQL Server role. And I'm not actually, I think Victor had been advocating removing the role type construct, which I believe to me makes sense to do.
Yeah, okay, that makes more sense what you just said.
Yeah, and actually, I think we do need to remove role type, but and I missed that in the review. I'll check with Victor. Let's see. Okay.
It would actually be really useful if in understanding this diagram, if it could be, for example, a corresponding diagram or something similar that just just shows a fictional real-world example of, with actual names. So yeah, things like MySQL and Node 1, Node 2, and real names for the deployment, like staging and production, and just real-world things, so we can see how it maps onto these object types, and how the various types of abstraction or what they mean in the real world. I think that would make it a lot easier to digest this stuff.
That's a great suggestion. I'm happy to do that. I agree. It'll definitely aid in the description.
Thanks.
Sure, you're welcome. Feedback's awesome. Let's see. There's number 7 is pretty straightforward, and then there was an 8 that showed up in my review and prep for this meeting, and now role type, I guess, is a 9th. I'll throw that in. JigMap was an over-engineering ambition based on the thought that I could create a generic pattern for inbound attributes. And when I did the inbound attribute path, if you remember that, I threw it away because it was way too complex in practice. And so I was trying to be dry too early, and that's what the comments say. So I'm expecting we'll go back to it and put a model back in once we actually know what it should be. But for now, I'm just going to code in the mapping, which I think is actually easier and more maintainable than a lot of generic code. There's an 8th item in here on the Trello cards that I added, which was the removal of private roles. And I'll try and document that and send it, but we added private roles to accomplish a use case that Andy had been flagging, and I'm not sure that I don't think it's required for us to have a private role on every deployment. It adds some overhead. So Victor's suggestion was ditch them. Keep maybe the concept of I'm not even sure that we need the concept of the private role at this point. So the suggestion is to eliminate it until we need it.
And that was machinery for conveying system information Two particular deployments?
The concept would be that there was information that Crowbar wanted to have that wouldn't get expressed to the jigs.
Yeah.
And so the idea would be there'd be some, secret's the wrong word, some user configuration information that we didn't need to inject into attributes. And the use case is perfectly logical. I just don't know that we need the machinery for it right now. Just like I'm pulling out the machinery for the split attributes where an attribute has bulk requested, and that's going sorry, I missed saying that's going away too, because now a proposed deployment and a proposed snapshot is a proposed attribute, and a actual attribute is just one tied to an active. It's very simple, very simple. Yay! Win. So that, and I think, and there was the other point that we had the role type going away. So I'll add design.
Could I suggest? I think actually this has been suggested before, and it's maybe a dangerous rat hole of naming to go down, but rather than just calling it proposed snapshot, I think we're considering just using proposal still, because using the term proposal, because like in the case where it hasn't been applied yet, there's nothing wrong with the word proposal at all. The original objection that I raised to the use of the word was only when after it's been applied, then it's no longer a proposal. But I think if we called it proposals and then huge proposals and then applying proposals and then active snapshots or something like that, it seems a bit strange to have a proposed snapshot.
So the interesting thing about the way that I have the code implemented is that I have aliases that do exactly what you're suggesting, and in the UI and in most of our nomenclature, we do exactly that. So we talk about a proposal, we talk about an active deployment, an applying deployment, and a queued deployment. So the language is really useful and straightforward. The only time I inject the word snapshot, which I still have mixed feelings on that word, but I feel like it's been very functional, so I'm not keen to change it. The snapshot is really just helps with the pointer reference to aggregate roles together. So it really is a timeline component, provides a deployment timeline tick, if you will. And so in the use of the Crowbar and a lot of the code, the snapshot itself disappears in favor of exactly the language that you're talking about. But I don't want to have 4 different types of objects for that, because it truly is a deployment changing state. We don't recopy the information when it goes from proposed to queued. We just update the pointer.
Sure. Yeah. I was definitely not suggesting changing the object model, just that sort of attribute field. The proposed snapshot thing. That sounds cool. What you've done.
Okay. I consider it a fail if the word snapshot ends up exposed to users. Or
okay. Yeah.
I don't think we can avoid it in the APIs, but in the UI, it shouldn't be there. We've gotten to an hour. My goal here was to key off a discussion on the list to move asynchronously.
So the document is available, right? If anybody else wants to take a look at it, you saw the emails. I uploaded it multiple ways, so it should be available to anybody. If there are any discussions of further things, as Rob has said, I think the point is, Ralph and whoever wasn't here, it might be wise for them to, Adam, maybe for you to give them a rundown of what we talked about, and then if they have any concerns or anything like that, they can chime in and voice their opinions on the list themselves. Yeah, as you said, it's an hour now. So in that interest of ending the meeting on time, I suppose if there's anything else pressing that needs to be discussed, thank you for attending and chiming in. And I guess we will talk next week on Thursday to go over Pebbles items and whatever else there is to be discussed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Take it easy.